Hello everyone, today we're exploring some chilling stories with a Soviet-era vibe. Before we start, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. I want to tell you a terrifying story that happened in 1981. I kept quiet about it for a long time because I couldn't recover from the shock. Besides, I was afraid people wouldn't understand me. My wife and I had dreamed of having our own dacha for many years, and finally, as soon as we had saved enough money, we began looking for a suitable plot. One in the Peatbog area caught our eye. The price was low, probably because the house and the grounds were severely neglected. But we weren't afraid of a challenge. In June, Lena and I took a vacation and moved into the dacha. We started fixing the place up, and the question arose of where to store our food. We didn't have a refrigerator, so we had to come up with something like an icebox. I noticed an abandoned cellar in the far corner, a grassy mound with a small metal door at its base. It turned out it wasn't easy to open. 2 huge padlocks hung on rusty latches. I found this strange. Why such precautions? With the help of some heavy tools, I finally managed to get the cellar open. It was a concrete bunker built to last, in the center of which was a hole about 3 feet in diameter, covered by a sheet of metal. A cold draft was coming from it. I tossed a stone down, but never heard it hit the bottom. I figured there was sand or sawdust down there. My wife and I decided to put our food in a bucket and lower it on a rope into the hole, where it was coldest. That same day, I rigged up a hoisting mechanism so Lena could retrieve the food without straining herself. The very next morning, my wife went to the cellar for butter and eggs for breakfast. She came back pale, her hands shaking. She told me to go look for myself. I go into the bunker, look into the bucket, and there, instead of food, are shriveled, dried up lumps, as if they had been sitting there for years, not just one night. What the hell? I didn't have a flashlight, so I decided to lower a kerosene lamp. Strangely, even a 30-foot rope wasn't enough to reach the bottom, and the concrete walls went even further down. When I pulled the lamp back up, I didn't recognize it. It looked as if it had aged 100 years, completely covered in rust. The new nylon rope also looked like it had been through the wringer. It was all frayed and dilapidated. It felt as if time sped up in that tunnel. Right around that time, the owner of the neighboring plot, Tolik, arrived. Seeing that we had opened the cellar, he asked to take a look. He said he had dreamed of finding out what was inside since he was a kid. According to his father, this cellar had been there since the Civil War, long before the land was parceled out for dachas. The locals considered it cursed, which was why the padlocks had been hung on it. The people who lived here before us didn't even try to look inside. They were too scared. Maybe that's why they eventually abandoned the dacha. I told Tolik about our experiments with the food and the kerosene lamp. He just chuckled in response. Our vacation ended, and we returned to the city. The following weekend, we arrive at the dacha and the police are there. It turned out that in our absence, Tolik had invited some buddies over and showed them our cellar. Eventually, in their drunken state, the guys decided to climb down. Maybe they'd find some buried treasure. They tied up the skinniest guy and started lowering him. After about 15 feet, the guy stopped responding, so they pulled him back to the surface. But instead of a living person, a skeleton in tattered clothes was dangling on the rope. That's when they ran to get the police. The detectives didn't believe the caller's story. By the looks of it, the remains were decades old. They called in the forensics team. One of them tried to go down into the well, but couldn't even make it 3 feet. He suddenly felt sick. When he climbed back out, everyone gasped. Instead of a 25-year-old man, an old man stood before them. Anyway, after that incident, the government bought out both our plot and all the neighboring ones. They surrounded the area with a solid tall fence, posted guards, and we never heard anything about that cellar again. What I want to tell you happened a long time ago, in 1986. But as they say in books in such cases, I remember everything that happened precisely to this day. So in the summer of 1986, I was 16 years old and getting ready to enter my final year of school. It was my last carefree summer. The following year would bring final exams, university admissions, and all the accompanying hassle and bustle. As it turned out, we had to wait until August for our planned trip to the seaside. Mom couldn't get vacation time any earlier. Therefore, it was decided at a family council to send me to the village. My grandmother, who used to own a house in a village near Ryazan where they were planning to send me, died when I was only 4 years old. But Mom had 3 sisters, Aunt Zhenya, Aunt Katya, and Aunt Shura. Aunt Zhenya got married and left to work in Chisinau. Aunt Katya and her husband lived in the north, and Aunt Shura, who was rightfully considered the eccentric of the family, enthusiastically embraced the idea of moving back to the village where she spent her entire childhood. Luckily for her, a position opened up at the local school for a biology teacher, which is exactly what my aunt was. Aunt Shura loved it in the village. Mom and I rarely visited her because I was usually sent to a pioneer camp for the summer, and Mom didn't really care for village life. I have only pleasant memories of those rare visits. Aunt Shura and I were always especially close. Mom had good reason to be jealous. I even got my name, Leova, from my aunt. My aunt was very well read and knew a ton of interesting things. She taught me how to identify forest and garden plants and distinguish bird calls. She told me about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and using pebbles and pine cones, she vividly demonstrated the course of the Battle of Kulikovo and the Battle of Borodino, and it was she who taught me how to navigate in the forest. I loved the forest and wasn't afraid of it at all, even at night, entirely thanks to Aunt Shura. Anyway, back to 86. I spent all of June in bliss, disappearing with my buddies into the village outskirts from early morning until late evening. I swam in the pond until my lips turned blue, sunbathed, and raced my bike through the meadows. I went into the forest too, but never ventured particularly far. Then one day I got the idea to walk to the neighboring village of Sosnovo through the forest, to test my navigation skills, so to speak. My aunt, naturally, wasn't opposed to this idea. She gave me a compass, a map, and some dry rations, issued some general instructions on how to behave in the woods, and let me go. I should mention that our area was always quiet, the forest wasn't too dense, and there were hardly any wild animals. Though personally, I'm not sure I would have let a 16-year-old city slacker go on such a trip alone if I were Aunt Shura. But my aunt, as I mentioned, was an eccentric and a daredevil. At first, everything was just great. I covered half the distance without any adventures, spotted all the landmarks my aunt had pointed out, and was confident that I'd be there in about an hour and a half. The damp green moss was springy underfoot. A woodpecker was tapping somewhere, and a cuckoo was calling. It smelled of pine needles, resin, and faintly of mushrooms. I was surrounded by a cozy green twilight, and the pines rustled in the wind overhead. I regretted not bringing my camera from home. I could have taken some great shots for the school wall newspaper, but then something went wrong. Instead of thinning out and getting lighter as I had expected, the forest was getting darker, gloomier, and denser. I increasingly encountered old spruce trees and fern thickets. The forest fell silent. No birds or animals could be heard. Instead, real hordes of mosquitoes appeared, against which even the clove cologne I'd prudently brought along offered no protection. On top of that, my compass was behaving very strangely, to put it mildly. The needle would spin like crazy, then freeze and fail to react to any of my movements. Something told me I was lost. But how? I had been following the map and compass strictly, but I had no choice but to keep walking. It wasn't like I could sit down in the moss and cry for my mom, really. Trying to fight back a nasty, sticky feeling of helplessness and fear, I pushed on. After half an hour of walking, the forest suddenly thinned out, and I emerged onto a well-trodden path. Strange. My aunt hadn't mentioned anything about this, but a path is always a good thing. It would lead somewhere, and I'd figure it out from there. And it did indeed lead somewhere. I found myself in a large clearing where a settlement was situated. Not the one I was heading to, of course, but it was full of people, which meant someone could point me in the right direction, or maybe even give me a ride. People were bustling about the settlement, busy with their chores. I was surprised that everyone was dressed rather old-fashionedly. In my aunt's village, only the very oldest grandmas and grandpas dressed like that. Photographs from the Great Patriotic War popped into my memory. Well, ultimately, what difference did it make to me how they were dressed? I knocked on the door of the house nearest to me. It was opened by an old man who somewhat resembled the dead Moroz they used to invite to my kindergarten. Tall, sturdy, with a fluffy snow-white beard. The old man stared at me questioningly. "Excuse me, I'm from Teterevki. I was heading to Sosnovo and I got a bit lost. Could you please tell me the fastest way to get from here to Sosnovo? It's getting late." The old man sighed heavily, frowned, and replied after a pause. "I don't know any Sosnovo. There's just deep woods further on. We're Nosovo here." Weird old guy, I thought then. Sosnovo was built a long time ago. He ought to know it. He spoke smoothly, held himself confidently, and didn't seem senile. Well, who knows? Meanwhile, the old man invited me into his cabin to rest and have some tea before hitting the road. He promised to explain in detail how I could get home. The old man's tea was delicious, brewed with wild strawberry and black currant leaves. I distinctly remember that its flavor grew more intense with every sip, as sometimes happens in a dream. The cabin was spacious and very clean. In a corner on a cot lay some children's toys: a wooden horse on wheels, a worn teddy bear missing a paw, and a rag doll. Bunches of dill and parsley were drying by the stove. My aunt stored provisions for the winter the exact same way. On the wall hung a large black and white photograph of a laughing girl, about 6 years old, wearing a patterned headscarf. Catching my gaze, the old man nodded at the photograph. "My granddaughter, Glashenka. She fell ill, so her parents took her to the city to see a doctor." I smiled at him and wished Glashenka a speedy recovery. The hot drink was soothing. I had almost entirely forgotten about the crazy compass and the strange, quiet forest. I felt sleepy. The old man sat across from me, repeatedly casting glances at the window, which was covered by a faded curtain. I think I dozed off. I was jolted awake by the alarming cawing of crows, which was growing louder. A distinct smell of burning wafted in from somewhere. The old man was standing by the window, leaning against the wall. I called out to him, "Grandpa, what happened? It smells like burning. Do you smell it?" The old man slowly turned his head toward me and said, "We didn't make it in time again. And you didn't make it either, lad. What a pity. But what can you do now?" He turned around, opened the door, and walked out of the cabin. Thoroughly frightened, I hurried after him. Crows were frantically darting back and forth above the village, cawing hysterically. My eyes immediately began to sting from the smoke enveloping the clearing. Over the crows' cries, the crackling of burning trees could be heard. The entire village was crowded together, watching as the fire crept closer and closer to the houses. A forest fire had surrounded the clearing and was approaching the houses on the very edge, and the people just stood there and looked at it with a terrifying sense of resignation on their faces. I had never seen anything like it again, and then something completely unimaginable happened. As one, the villagers turned and walked toward the fire. One by one, they disappeared into the smoke, without a single scream, in total silence. I think I was yelling something at them, telling them they needed to jump into the pond, if there was one, to hide in their cellars, to do something, anything to save themselves. But it was as if they couldn't hear me. The old man went last. Meanwhile, the fire had engulfed the outermost houses. When he had almost reached one of the burning cabins, he turned back to me, shook his head, and yelled, "I'm sorry, lad. We forgot about the fire again. We forget every year, and now we've let you down too. Forgive us for God's sake." And he stepped into the flames. I was left completely alone in the middle of a burning village. I was suffocating from the smoke and couldn't see a thing. My eyes were watering. I fell to the ground, covered my head with my hands, and burst into tears, and the flames roared above me. I screamed until I felt I had nothing left to breathe, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, it was early morning. I was lying on grass damp with dew, and a grasshopper was chirping somewhere nearby. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean, cool air. I was still terrified to open my eyes. Memories of the burning village and the people walking into the flames flooded my mind. Cautiously cracking one eye open, I was surprised to find no trace of a recent fire anywhere around me. However, the village was gone from the clearing too. Pines, spruces, and scattered birches were green with summer foliage. The grass was knee-high. Looking closely, I managed to spot the remains of foundations hidden in the grass here and there. And as I walked around the clearing, I tripped a few times, stepping into the sunken depressions of former cellars. long since caved in and overgrown. More than anything, I just wanted to get out of there, which I did, without even trying to look for my compass and map. After half an hour of wandering through the forest, I emerged onto a road where, to my luck, some summer resident's Zhiguli car was driving by. He looked me over from head to toe, shivering and pale, and after listening to my story about getting lost in the woods, I thought it wise not to mention the fire, offered to drive me straight to my village. At home, my aunt, exhausted from a sleepless night, was waiting for me, along with the neighbors who had gathered to search for me. Assessing the situation, my neighbor, Baba Glasha, dragged the driver into her cabin to feed him breakfast and fresh milk, leaving my aunt to deal with me. However, when I tried to explain what had happened to me while wrapped in a blanket, I burst into tears again like a little kid, and my aunt had to revive me with valerian drops. It wasn't until a couple of hours later that I could speak normally. Aunt Shura listened in silence to my disjointed story. Then she got up, poured us both some homemade rowan tincture, took a drink and said, "Well, you know me, I'm an atheist and quite the skeptic, but you're a sensible, rational boy and you've never had any mental issues." She set her glass down, wiped her hand down her face, sighed and continued, "You see, not far from Sosnovo in the forest there was a village before the war, Nosovo, just like you said. It hasn't been on any maps for a long time, because right before the war, it burned down in a forest fire. Everyone who was there at the time died because the fire surrounded the settlement on all sides. Those from Nosovo who were lucky enough not to be in the village that day went their separate ways after the fire. Baba Glasha is actually from there. That year she turned 7, and you could say she got lucky catching appendicitis. Her parents went with her to the hospital, but her grandfather stayed behind, and he died. Just don't tell her anything about this. Her grandfather, as I remember him from the photographs she showed me, is exactly the man who served you tea." She fell silent again. "Does that mean I saw ghosts? But you said they don't exist." "It seems, Lyovka, that you did. And honestly, I don't know what else to tell you about it. I've never understood any of this mystical stuff. You'd better get some sleep and forget all this. Try to, at least." I tried, and I even succeeded, but years later, that forest village still sometimes visits me in my dreams. After those dreams, I wake up suffocating and coughing from smoke that isn't really there. So those are the stories, guys. Make sure to drop a comment with your thoughts on the stories and the video overall. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Bye.